today's presentation, I'm going to show you how to set up the backbone of what will ultimately become your dashboard and your dashboards themselves. And it's my hope that these concepts will allow you to extrapolate out to any other forms of data you may want to visualize regarding your athletes. As an aside to this presentation, I've gone ahead and pre-formatted a lot of what I will be showing you and entering data into in the interest of time, as most people are just interested in the nitty-gritty of the formulations and calculations of setting all this up. So without much more to say, let's go ahead and jump right into it with our first tab, which will be the Settings tab. Again, this is one of those backbone tabs that will ultimately set up everything that you'll do regarding your athlete data. So the first part in this first array of column A is going to be kind of our logistical workings, and that's going to enable us to have the dates that we want to work from, the number of athletes that we're working with, and then set up our acute and chronic ratio workload time frames on the chance that we end up wanting to change those at some point. So let's go ahead and just start with a start date of September 1st. I'm going to go ahead and enter that into cell A2. The next cell down is the number of athletes, and we can either do this manually and count the athletes on our roster, or we can take one less thing we have to do when we need to reset our dashboards, and we can go ahead and use a counting formula. Now, you can't just use count because that's only going to count numeric values, so we have to use what's called count, and you see as I start typing, it gives me the description of the various formulas that I could use. So you see count, it says the number of numeric values. We're not dealing with numeric values, we're dealing with string text. So I'm going to use count open parentheses. Now, when you get to referring to your cells, and we'll talk through this with a lot of our other formulas, you can either use what's called an absolute reference or a relative reference. An absolute reference is the usage of the money signs in front of either the row, the column, or both the row and the column to lock a cell reference down. So because I'm not dragging this formula anywhere, I'm going to go ahead and just use a relative reference because it does not matter. So I'm going to type in C3, which is the first cell that I can enter athletes' names into, and you see it's already starting to give me a count of 1. I'm going to use a colon because I want to create a range, and then I'm just going to type C, which will count all the rest of the values within that column. Once I do that, you'll see it's counting 10 athletes and showing me the value that I'll get outputted from completing the formula. So I'm going to close parentheses and hit enter. And you'll see there that it counts my 10 athletes. As you can see, this cell is formatted a little bit differently than the date formula. And I like to do this to denote areas that data can be entered versus cells that should be left alone because they have formulas working. Just makes it easier to know where things need to be changed and where things need to be left alone because they'll work automatically. So the next one down are the number of days in my acute and my chronic, and for simplicity's sake, let's just go ahead and use 7 days and 28 days respectively. Should you want to come back later, or you have multiple teams that you're going to roll this out for, and let's say you do want to have them operating on different time frames for their acute and chronic workings, you can come back here and have a formula already set up and have your training load formulas working off of this cell value rather than have it manually entered within that formula and having to go back and retroactively change all of your cell workings. So let's just go ahead and put in our exponentially weighted moving average formula, the one that I like because I think the exponential decay that occurs when you have a rest period behaves a bit more like fitness does. So we're going to go ahead and go 2 divided by, and in parentheses, because of order of operations, A6 plus 1. Again, I'm using a relative reference because it doesn't matter. I'm not dragging that cell value down. And then we'll do the exact same for our chronic. So we're going to do equals 2 divided by parentheses A8 because that is our chronic time frame plus 1. And you see there I get those two values. And I'll end up referring back to those values when I get to the training load entry page. So that is the first part of my settings tab that I'll be working with. The next one are the roster tabs. And here I really don't have to do much because I've already entered all of my athletes and their data, again in the interest of time. But I do need to set up a couple of named ranges that I'll refer back to just for making writing formulas out a bit easier. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight the athletes' names from Andre 3000 down to Kier Wenham Flat. I'm then going to go into data, select named ranges, and you'll see that I have these ranges named, but I'll go ahead and click in and show you. It just says settings, exclamation point, C3 to C12, and then I'm just going to name that as name. So that is already done for me. The second one I'm going to have to set up would be the full roster value named range. And this is just going to allow me to pull back their class designation and their positions so that when I get into pivot charts or deeper analytics regarding my training load data, I can very easily just refer to that range and have it do VLOOKUPs to that range. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight from Andre 3000's name all the way down to Kier Wenham Flat's position of attacker. So that's C3 to E12. And you'll see again, I've already set that up and I've just named it as roster. The last part of this is the remaining columns. You can do a few things here. You can either set up to have designations for if you have athletes running a particular monitoring tool, such as Omega Wave. You could go in and set this up to say Omega Wave, and let's say that the Wu-Tang Clan was testing on Omega Wave. You could put a Y for yes, and then it just becomes about writing a conditional formula that takes into account whether or not they have a Y in that particular column to run a certain formula, and if they don't, to run a different formula. But again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and just leave this as a very easy RPE and duration entry point that I can print sheets off and manually take the RPEs and durations. If you're doing a different way of recording, that's obviously up to you. You can get rid of this column if you'd like, but just providing that idea. The last piece that we need to do is set up our week ID. And again, we've already got our start date point set up. So what we need to do is we just need to set cell value I3 equal to A2. And we can just make that a relative reference again because we are not going to end up dragging that down. So that will naturally be our week 1. From there, what we're going to do is we're going to take cell I3 and we're going to add 7 to it to turn it over to the next week. And you'll see again, it's already popping out that information. Now, the nice thing is that Google Sheets, in the same way that Excel will, it has an intuition about what you're probably trying to do. So if I grab that blue box in the bottom right corner, selecting week 1, and I drag down, you see it pulls me right to week 2. And then all I need to do is grab the date and grab the week designation and drag all the way down to the bottom. And you'll see there it automatically fills in the entirety of the year. This will become useful when we're doing weekly analytics on all of our data to have references to pull back to and end up using approximate matches to match dates to a particular week. And then the last part of this is just to set up our range for the week ID. So I'm going to select in I3, going to drag all the way down to week 52, go into data, named ranges, and then I will go to week ID, which is obviously the pre-named value that I've already set up. And you'll see it's set up to go from I3 to J54, and I've just named it week ID. I will go ahead and hit close, and then I'm done with my settings tab. Again, very simple in nature right now. There's a ton that you can do on this page to ultimately allow you to hide this tab, but this is going to be our starting point for the remainder of this presentation. The next page that we're going to set up is our form responses page that intakes all of our wellness data from the athlete's form submissions and allows us to put it to a wellness score that we create depending on how we view that we need to visualize that data. So one of the nice features of Google Sheets is the integration you can have with one of their other platforms called Google Form, which allows you to create surveys that you can send out to the athletes or even have them install as an app button on their phone. And this works for both Apple products and for Android products. So if I go to Form, I can go ahead and just show you real quick what that looks like. So it'll link it automatically to a Google Sheet if you wanted to import or export the raw data per se. One of the important things I'll tell you with this is that how you have the athletes submit their name, either you need to have a formula to rework it so that it puts last name first and then first name with a comma, or you can have it set up to just do last name, comma, first name. However you set it up, just make sure that it's going to end up formatting the way that your data points are formatted. Otherwise, you're going to have difficulty pulling back the appropriate data. So, variety of ways you can do wellness surveys. Obviously, the limits are really just your confines of what you want to ask and what you hold to be important for them to give you feedback on. So you can ask about sleep, soreness, mood, energy, nutrition, motivation. It's really, my only recommendations would be to keep it brief and keep the scaling consistent. So you can use a 1 to 5 scale, 1 to 10 scale, whatever it may be. Just make sure that your values always are going to reflect positive change. So you want higher values to be the better values. So a couple questions there as an example, and you make them all required so that they can't bypass them. Last part, if you want to do something to where you're getting feedback on soreness or pain, you can set this up. So you could have one for pain, and you could export points that athletes are having pain, or you could do a soreness heat map, like I'll show you how to make on the final team dashboard, where you can ask a question like this, and they can check all the areas that are sore for them on a given day, and you can see the team trends to see if anything needs to be addressed, either from a therapeutic standpoint or from a training standpoint. But for now, let's go ahead and go back to our form responses tab. And I've uploaded all of this data myself, so it's not coming in exactly formatted how you would expect to see a form submission. Normally with the timestamp, you're going to get an hour, minute, and a second designation as to when the form was submitted. But the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a data point that we can refer to pull back their wellness value. So I'm going to come over here to column L. And the easiest way to do this is to just use a concatenate formula, which takes text or takes strings of text and puts them together. I'm just going to do a concatenate of the athlete's name, comma, and the timestamp. Now, if the timestamps came in formatted like this, you'd be good to go. But because the typical submission style is that it comes with a hour, second, or hour, minute, and second designation, you need to use a formula called date value, which just takes it to that 5-digit formatting that you want to be able to refer to, so that it's not looking to exactly match that date, hour, minute, second timestamp. So I'll close off that date value formula, close off the concatenate formula, and you see it creates a data point for me that's 3000, Andre 43709, which makes it entirely unique and easy to refer back to as you get that data, or if you want to create a tab where you're able to go back and look at the athlete at different points, you can very easily do that with this data point now set up. Next part of this gets a little bit redundant, but putting in the work on the front end, again, allows you to be more efficient on the back end, because you can run a script that will ultimately run these formulas for you automatically. And you'll see I have some abbreviations up there. Again, this isn't too important. This is going to end up being something that you can hide and it not necessarily show sport coaches, because you don't want them, one, either deleting formulas, or two, worrying too much about these numbers themselves. So first one we're going to set up is for the sleep quality question. And you see I have RA, ST Dev, and Z, and then wellness up there for each question I asked. That's rolling average, standard deviation, Z score, and then the wellness score. So let's go ahead and start with our rolling average. We're just going to use a 7-day rolling average, as is tends to be common practice. And because of the fact that the average ifs formula is not an array function, you have to use a formula called array formula. And this is one of the unique features of Google Sheets, whereas in Excel, you normally just hit Control-Shift-Enter when you finish an array formula. And that'll make it an array formula. But you can just use this array formulation around your average ifs. Average ifs. Now, we're just looking to average the sleep quality, and that was in column C. So I'm going to do C2, and I'm using absolute references here. One, because you need the absolute reference for the row so that it locks to the first data point, and then it'll go all the way through to the last one in that column. The absolute reference for the column doesn't necessarily matter. You're going to have to go in and change it either way. Because you're moving it so many cells over that it won't just move over to column D when you go to do the soreness rolling average. So it doesn't matter. I happen to think it makes it easier that if you copy and paste it over, you just have to move it one letter forward. So I know when I do the soreness rolling average, I'll just change C to D. So looking to do the average range for the sleep quality metrics, the first part is going to be entering the criteria range. So the first criteria that I want it to match to is the name. So I'm going to use B2 to B, again, absolute reference, because I want it to refer to the entire array. And then I'm going to want it just to be equal to B2. And that's going to be an absolute reference to the column, because I don't want that column to change as I copy and paste these formulas over, but a relative reference for the name, because as that form submissions come in, I want that cell value to turn over and refer to the athlete that submitted that form. The second part is to set the time frame that I want it to pull from. So I'm going to, again, absolute reference to the timestamp column, A2 to A, with money signs in front of all characters. And now I want it to be less than or equal to the current date. So to set up a less than or greater than within a criteria range and then criterion-based formula, you need to put quotations around the signs that you use to denote less than or equal to. So I'm going to put quotation marks, close quotation marks, and then to link it to the cell that you were trying to refer to, you have to use an ampersand. And then I'll do absolute reference A, relative reference 2, because we're going to want that date to scroll with the submissions as they come in. So that locks down and says that it has to be less than or equal to the current date. Then I'm going to create the back end of my time frame reference. So I'm going to use that same absolute reference of A2 to A. And now it's just going to be greater than, close quotations, ampersand, A2 minus 7. So it's going to take back today's value and then the last 6 days to give us that 7-day rolling average. This is why I'm only using greater than and not greater than or equals to. And you'll see it's giving me that value of 3. Close off the average ifs, close off the array, hit enter. And you'll see I get that rolling average value of 3, which reflects the one submission that Andre 3000 has had for his rolling average or for his sleep quality. The standard deviation formula is set up in a very similar format, but it is an array formula because of the integration of the filter formula that I'm going to show you. So the first part that we're going to set up is an if error, because you won't get any variance on the first day and we don't want that to be an errored value. We just want it to reflect as a 0 value. So I'm going to use if error, and then I'll start typing in ST, and as you see there's a wide variety of standard deviation formulas to refer to. Whichever one you've settled on, just make sure you use it for all of them. So I'm going to use standard dev P. So then it's asking me for a value to enter. But because we have to filter and make this a criterion-based standard deviation formula, I'm going to use my filter formula, which as you can see from the description, gives you the opportunity to function effectively as a conditional formula. So I'm going to type that in, and then it's asking me for the range. So the range is the same range we've been referring to, C2 to C. Next, it's asking for a condition. So this is going to ask you for both the range that you're referring to and the condition that must be met for that to happen. So it's an abbreviation of what we did for our rolling average. So I'm going to use B2 to B. And I just want to say that it's equal to absolute reference column B, relative reference row 2. That is the first condition. Second condition is the date range. So I'm going to use A2 to A, absolute reference. And same setup, but I don't need the quotation marks this time. I want it to be less than or equal to A2, absolute reference to the column, relative reference to the row. And then, again, greater than A2 minus 7. Close that, close that. Now I get back to the if error. So that's the value that if there's an error that gets calculated from that, just give it a 0. It's going to be the first day of data. You don't want it to show up as an error. Just have it reflect as a 0 value. And you'll see I get that value of 0 for the standard deviation. Now, I've gone through and worked out the rolling average, worked out the standard deviation to make this z-score formulation a little bit easier and allow you to, again, get into the weeds of your individual metrics should you desire to. So, again, I'm going to set up an if error because it would receive an error otherwise. And then when you standardize is how you calculate the z-score. Then it asks me for the value, the mean, and the standard deviation. So I have my value over in, let me go back. Apologies. So I have my value over in C2. Then I can scroll over here and I have my rolling average in M2. And then finally I have my standard deviation in N2. I close all that off, then it asks me for the value if it's an error, and I hit 0, enter, and again, because there's no variance in the scores yet because it's the first day, it's just going to give me a 0 value. The last part of this is the wellness scoring, and in general, it's pretty widely accepted to use z-scores to reflect how the athlete's doing relative to their normal perception. So if two athletes are sleeping and one constantly sleeps a 7 and the other is sleeping at what they rate as a 3, and all of a sudden that athlete who sleeps a 3 sleeps at a 7, that athlete's perception of how they're doing that day is going to be noticeably better. And we want to reflect that perception of they're going to be doing much better than they normally feel. So, in order to do that, let's just go ahead and say that we're going to use anything outside of one standard deviation from their normal values is going to be that they're doing way better or way worse than normal. And anything within one standard deviation is going to be that they're doing about the same to slightly worse or slightly better. And we're just going to give them a point or points based upon how they're doing. So they get 4 points if they're greater than one standard deviation better, 3 points if they're 0 to 1 standard deviation above their values, 2 points for 0 to -1, and then anything that's worse than -1 standard deviation from their normal is going to just give them 1 point. The way we set that up is a series of if statements. And the if statement is going to be if O2 is greater than or equal to 1, give them 4 points.
That is the end of the free preview of this webinar. If you would like to continue watching this, please head to strengthcoachnetwork.com, click on the Become a Member, and you will be able to check out this webinar and the entire site for $1 for a trial membership. Again, head to strengthcoachnetwork.com and be able to check this webinar out for only $1.